On today's show, the NBA draft lottery is now in the books, which means draft season, if it wasn't already here, it's definitely here in earnest. Less than 6 weeks away until the NBA draft. We'll have all of the reaction to the lottery, and I'll be joined by Andrew Kelly of Peachtree Hoops, talking about some draft stuff, takeaways for the Hawks, the top of the lottery, etc. All of that and more coming up.
You are Locked On Hawks, your daily Atlanta Hawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 1241 of the Locked On Hawks podcast. I am your host, Brad Rowland, coming to you on a Tuesday evening into Wednesday. And thank you for joining us, as always, on this podcast, making us your first listen each and every day. Check us out on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube on the video side. Please subscribe via all those platforms across the board. It's the best way to support the show. And again, thank you for joining us as always. Today's podcast will be myself and Andrew Kelly momentarily joining me from Peachtree Hoops. Andrew is very smart, and actually he'll be back later on this week as well with some fake trade extravaganza. But this time around, focusing on the draft in reaction to the lottery. Of course, the Hawks not participating in the lottery this time around, being in the playoffs, no ping pong balls bouncing for the Hawks, but still some fallout. And if you have listened to this podcast for long enough, you will know that I just love the draft overall. So I have some reaction at the top of the draft and then some Hawks related stuff. For a lot of people, I think this is kind of the day when the draft gets real in a lot of ways. For the more casual observers, the draft is now less than 6 weeks away, a little bit more than 5 weeks away, actually, about 5.5 weeks. So we're getting into crunch time here for the NBA draft. We'll have plenty of coverage on that in this space, but sort of a primer at the top, and then we'll get into myself and Andrew on the draft. And then again, later this week, some fake trade stuff, because Andrew is always dialed in, and we'll talk about the big names, Donovan Mitchell, Rudy Gobert, DeAndre Ayton, et cetera. That's coming up later this week, and best time to subscribe to the podcast is right now. As for today, a lot of results, of course, are in. The Orlando Magic, the Hawks Southeast Division rival, if you want to say that, have the number one pick on the draft. It's a fascinating decision for Orlando. This is a draft overall, which we'll get into with Andrew and other people in the future. There is no consensus number one overall pick. I think a lot of people basically have one of four players at the top of this class: Chet Holmgren from Gonzaga, Jabari Smith from Auburn, Paulo Banchero from Duke, or Jaden Ivey from Purdue. Has a lot of fans as well. I think for me, Chet's number one on my board, but very narrowly at this point, and it's definitely not a tier break. It's kind of like those guys are all fairly similar evaluations, different players to be sure, but not a huge standout number one for me. I'd probably take the best guy regardless if I was Orlando. There is the thought that they have a lot of front court players, of course, but Mo Bamba's going to be a free agent, et cetera. They have Franz Wagner, who's more of like a combo forward type. So I'd probably go Chet if you maybe choose right now today for Orlando. Jabari Smith is a popular mock pick already. Both ESPN, Jonathan Gavoni, Mike Schmitz, as well as Sam Vecini, front of the podcast, have Jabari Smith number one at this moment, coming out of the lottery on Tuesday night. So keep an eye on all of that. Number two is Oklahoma City, their highest pick, by the way, since 2007. And of course, they drafted Kevin Durant that year. After that, they had Russell Westbrook and James Harden, who were both top four picks, not number two overall. So after they got very unlucky a year ago, the Thunder did. They got pretty lucky this time around, number two in the draft. They have to, of course, see what Orlando does, but I would like any of Chet or Jabari or Paolo to Oklahoma City. Jaden Ivey would be fine there as well. I'm not saying they wouldn't be, but they do have sort of a primary-ish guy in Shea, as well as Josh Giddey. They've kind of invested in those guys with the ball in their hands, so maybe more of a big along the way here. But Sam Presti's not shy, and they have 3 picks in the first round. They have 2 lottery picks. They have 2 and 12 overall, so some flexibility there for Oklahoma City as usual. Houston, number 3 overall, kind of taking whoever's left, but they're in this full rebuild. They're not shy either. No real bad fits there for the Rockets. And then Sacramento had the biggest move, going up to number 4 overall. Kind of a weird spot for them if the first 3 picks are Holmgren, Smith, and Banchero in some order, because Jaden Ivey not a perfect fit for Sacramento. Now, that high in the draft, and given the way that I feel about De'Aaron Fox and Davion Mitchell, I would just take Ivey if I thought that he was the best player available, but not the most natural fit with their current investments in Fox and Mitchell, the way they moved on from Halliburton, et cetera. We'll see, though. I've already seen some mocks of Keegan Murray there, or even Shaedon Sharpe there, some high upside guys. And Sharpe's definitely a huge upside swing. Murray a little bit less so. But interesting stuff in the top 4, and then we can go down from there if we want to. But people are asking how this affects the Hawks. Not really anything directly. We'll get into some stuff with Andrew Kelly about Jaden Ivey in particular later on this podcast. But that's more of a pie in the sky trade up notion. The Hawks could be aggressive and trade up if they want to, but for the most part, the top of the lottery wasn't going to affect too much of what the Hawks are doing. Just as a reminder, though, before we get any deeper into this, the Hawks have the number 16 overall pick. That is not going to change once they trade the pick. Number 44 is the second round pick for the Hawks this time around. And in the future, the Hawks have all of their own first-round picks. They've not traded any first-rounders in the future, and they have actually one extra pick. It's that pick in the Cam Reddish deal, which came from New York, but it's actually Charlotte's first-round pick. It's protected, which is why the Hawks don't have it this time around. But basically, the Hawks are in good shape. They have some extra second-round picks as well. They're definitely in the positive category in terms of future-facing draft assets. So if you want to trade up, even just like a kind of a modest trade up to 8, 9, 10, they have the capital to do that. And of course, the only time in the Schlenk era that the Hawks have actually traded up in a draft was to go get DeAndre Hunter, when they traded a few assets to go ahead and do that, and then probably overpaid to do that. But even then, it went from 8 up to 4. That costs a lot to go that far up at that point in the draft. If they were to go all the way up in the top 5 this year, it probably has to be some sort of crazy pick package, or someone like John Collins or DeAndre Hunter or something like that, building around that if you want to get pretty aggressive. I wouldn't necessarily advocate for that. We'll get into that more later on. It's also just pretty wide open for the Hawks. It's something I'm going to be saying a lot. I've already said it on this podcast a few times, but I did sort of an overview on the podcast a few weeks ago, and there are probably 15, 20, maybe even 25, if you want to get crazy, guys the Hawks could draft at 16 overall. That, of course, takes into account maybe a guy falls unexpectedly, like Jalen Johnson did a year ago. Like, no one basically had Jalen Johnson getting to 20 a year ago. Same with John Collins. When he fell to 19, that was a surprise. So there's probably 3 or 4 guys like that could fall further than I think they will. Then you have a group of 10 to 12 guys who I think would just be reasonable picks at 16 overall. And then maybe if Travis Schlenk falls in love with someone that's off the board, that's always possible too. This is a draft that's pretty flat in my mind in the Hawks range. So there are truly a lot of possibilities at this point. There are some guys that I think will be gone probably when the Hawks pick that I would like, from your Dyson Daniels, Jeremy Sohan, Johnny Davis, even if he were to fall. There's some more guys that I think are pretty realistic in some ways. Ty Washington, who's a guy that I actually mocked the Hawks tonight for dime in my first mock draft since the lottery, of course, was set. Also, like Tari Eason, who was in the Hawks training facility a couple weeks ago for a visit. Ochai Agbaji, Patrick Baldwin Jr. Those are very different players, but all guys I think would be pretty reasonable picks for the Hawks. And again, pretty wide open. We'll get some intel. I'm sure I'll probably start to hear some things more in the future now that we know the draft order. But that's going to be all about what's going to be happening there and kind of the fluidity of all of that. As for the mock drafts, I know I mentioned a second ago that I mocked Ty Washington to the Hawks. Also, so did ESPN. This evening, I saw a few people that were putting out mock drafts immediately. I know Sam Vecini, again, our friend of the podcast from The Athletic, who's been on the show a few times before, has Malachi Brandon from Ohio State to the Hawks 16 overall. It'd be a perfectly reasonable pick. He's more of an offense-first guy, but certainly a pretty strong creator on the wing. That might be a pretty intriguing upside pick. So lots and lots of names that we'll throw around in the near future. And lastly, before we get to Andrew, a couple people have asked me kind of if the Hawks stop their workouts, because none of the media, including myself, have been kind of tweeting out the list the last few days. The simple reason for that, by the way, is just that the NBA Draft Combine is happening this week in Chicago. That's where the lottery was for a reason. All of the league basically is there this week. Every team is there. The top guys are there. So basically putting on hold any of that in-house workout stuff for the next week or two. It'll be ramping up again soon, I am sure. But keep in mind that the Hawks and every other team does not have to have a specific player in their building in terms of a group workout. They've always done individual workouts. They're not necessarily as public as well. That's part of the fun in the first round, is sometimes agents don't want their guys to come in for draft workouts. It's a kind of a push-pull behind the scenes, the stuff that I'll hear that I can't report, etc. Always a little bit of a mystery this time of year. But all that said, workouts will be ramping up again next week and beyond once the combine is settled. And if you want to watch the combine coverage, it's definitely wall-to-wall stuff on ESPN. Pretty interesting time to be an NBA draft person. And again, about 5.5 weeks until the NBA draft. So keep it locked right here. And we'll have full coverage. We'll have guests in the future. I've already had a few already on this show. Last week, we had Mark Schindler talking about the draft. We've had previous guests. We had, all kinds of people last year as well. This is definitely a draft-based podcast for not the whole time. Obviously, we'll do some player capsules. And by the way, as a reminder, earlier this week, myself and Glenn Willis talked about both Danilo Gallinari and John Collins on the show. We'll have all the capsules rolling out in no particular order, just kind of talking about the guys that are key to the roster along the way. So we're definitely coming to you 3, 4, 5 times a week, even in the offseason, and hopefully that is appreciated. Okay, with all that said, before we get to Andrew, a word from our sponsors on today's podcast. Today's show is brought to you by Athletic Greens, and my schedule is pretty crazy all the time. I started taking Athletic Greens because I was trying to be healthier, have more energy, want to see what all the fuss was about, and I've been on it for a while at AG1. is really awesome. I absolutely love it. AG1 does not taste like anything that I've actually had before that was actually supposed to be super healthy. I actually look forward to taking AG1 each and every morning. It's the first thing I have when I wake up. It's just one delicious scoop of AG1 from Athletic Greens. It has 75 high-quality vitamins, minerals, whole food source superfoods, probiotics, adaptogens to help you start your day on the right note. And they have special blend of ingredients that support your nervous system, your immune system, your gut health, your energy, and gives you the ability to focus and recover. It's cheaper than your cold brew habit as well. That's always very nice for people like me that drink a lot of coffee. And AG1 also supports your sleep quality and recovery, as well as mental clarity and alertness. Right now, it's time to reclaim your health and arm your immune system with the convenient daily nutrition that AG1 and Athletic Greens can provide. Just one scoop of and a cup of water each and every day, and that is all you have to do for AG1. No need for a million different pills and supplements to look out for your health. And to make it even easier for you, Athletic Greens is giving you a free 1-year supply of immune-supporting vitamin D when you order right now. And they also have 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. All you have to do is go to athleticgreens.com/NBA network. That's athleticgreens.com/NBA network. Take ownership over your health and pick up the ultimate daily nutritional insurance. Today's show is brought to you by Built Bar, and imagine dipping your finger into that plastic tub of birthday cake frosting and then open your eyes realizing that it's only 150 calories and 16 grams of protein. That's what it's like to eat a birthday cake puff from Built Bar. I just received a box of birthday cake puffs, and I've had nothing else like it, quite honestly. They're available right now. We can't promise they'll still be there tomorrow, so get them right now at Built.com. If you haven't tried the puffs, I don't know what you're waiting on at this point. Make every single day your birthday with Built's birthday cake puffs, and Built has taken the delicious experience of biting into a fresh slice of birthday cake and robed it in 100% white chocolate, and they even added sprinkles. 150 calories, 16 grams of protein, 9 grams of sugar. This limited time flavor is an amazing option if you're looking for a healthy way of living and to get that flavor and variety in your day. All of the Built Puffs have 100% real chocolate around the outside. That means with Built, you can eat healthy and actually enjoy doing it. They're also made with collagen protein, which your body can absorb more efficiently, and that provides a ton of health benefits. Go to Built.com right now, get the birthday cake puffs and much more by using the promo code LOCKED15 when you get there. Promo code LOCKED15 will get you 15% off on the order with Built Bar, and all of that can be found at Built.com. One more time, that is promo code LOCKED15, 15% off at Built.com. I am joined now by friend of the podcast, NBA roster building connoisseur, Andrew Kelly is here. Hello, sir. How are you?
I'm great, man. Enjoying the demolition of the Suns in Game 7. Ready to talk some Hawks basketball.
Yeah, that was wild. We were recording this actually on Monday, so we're pre-lottery. I do want to do this part first and talk about some draft stuff. Obviously, the Hawks are not in the lottery, but the lottery will affect some things that happen on Tuesday, so we're going to be kind of general along the way. But before I ask you about some Hawks stuff, I do want to get your take. I kind of know what it is, but for people listening, what your kind of general philosophy is about the draft, both in general and also to put kind of a curveball behind this. The Hawks in 2022, because I know you see the same stuff that I do on Twitter. There's a large portion of the fan base that's kind of done drafting players now. They want to trade the pick for someone good now, and they saw what happened with Jalen Johnson last year, et cetera. So where's your head at, I guess, with the draft process this time around?
Well, in a vacuum, I would say my philosophy, at least in the lottery, is that you should try and draft for upside, simply because the avenues to acquiring, like the type of talent that you need to go deep in the playoffs, typically that comes in the early lottery or the mid lottery at least. And that's where you really want to be taking big swings for the most part. However, later on, I think you can take into account team need a lot more. And certainly with the Hawks now, especially with Nate McMillan as coach, I think you have to consider like the aptitude for a prospect to potentially play early. I think is something to monitor. You know, guys that might be 3 or 4 year guys that I might have discounted previously in the past just because I don't see the upside with them are now more relevant in a team that's trying to win now with Nate McMillan as head coach. So I think that you have to kind of adjust your philosophy in some ways according to the team situation, and that's particularly true with the Hawks.
Yeah, I made the comment, I think even to you or somebody in our Slack channel, about how it's kind of like Bud is back with regard to the draft. You know, famously when Bud was in charge, he was, of course, the weird head coach, president of basketball operations duo. But that 2016 draft in particular, when they drafted 2 old wings in Taurean Prince and DeAndre Bembry, pretty much expressly, and they kind of admitted it even, like they wanted guys who were closer to play because they were trying to win now. And you can argue with that philosophy. Of course, it's not always going to be productive, but it's also kind of practical when you know that Nate's your head coach and you know that situation. I still kind of lean in terms of maybe taking a swing down the line, but you have to know, especially right now, that if you do that, you got to wait and you got to be patient. I think Jalen Johnson was kind of a hybrid of those things. I think a year ago, we kind of knew, at least I said a lot, that with that team, the roster they had, with that coach, he wasn't going to play a lot. I still love that draft pick. He was not the most raw guy in the world. Obviously, he's a little bit raw. He had, of course, the short season at Duke, et cetera. But he was kind of the hybrid, but because he fell in their lap. I think nobody really thought he was going to be there at 20, and he did. Obviously, that could happen again this time around. But they could be looking at older guys. There are some 22-year-olds from like Ochai Agbaji. Tari Easton's a little bit older guy. Jalen Williams from Santa Clara might be in their range, like 21-year-old, 22-year-olds that are like more ready to play now versus like your Patrick Baldwin Jr. types, who is clearly a ways off after kind of a bad year at Milwaukee, but was a high-end RSCI guy, and your Kendall Browns, that kind of guys, like who are very far away. There's definitely different tacks you can take in this class. It sounds like you might want to go a little bit short term if they make the pick.
Yeah, I think so, like to a degree. I'm definitely open to upside there. I'm open to moving up to get more upside. But with where they're at in the draft, I mean, we just see the situation with Jalen Johnson last year, who I thought was a very good prospect, and he didn't play at all. I think you have to have realistic expectations for these guys, and that should influence your thinking to some degree. I don't think that you necessarily want to base your decision-making off of a coach, which tends to be more ephemeral. There's a lot of turnover all the time. But at the same time, I mean, I think you do have to plan on that to a degree. So for that reason, I'm probably more inclined to look at guys that have a chance to crack the rotation next year, like an Agbaji that you mentioned earlier, versus someone like a PBJ, who I think does have like tangible upside, but is going to take time to unlock that and may not have the consistent playing time needed in Atlanta to do so. So I think you have to factor that into your calculus with who you take there.
Yeah, and you can go the other direction too. It kind of depends on what your whole philosophy is. That makes it challenging always, talking about the draft being before free agency and before, it's sort of the kickoff of trade season as well in a lot of ways. But if you are planning to not necessarily run it back, but planning to have a core in place of 9, 10, 11 guys that you already want to play, it's easier to take someone like that's further away. And just planning on them not playing this year, almost making it a redshirt like they did with Jalen Johnson. I think that was probably part of the calculus last year, was that no matter who they drafted a year ago, they probably would not have planned to play that guy a lot. Obviously, there would have been some guys who were closer to playing than others. You could sort of dream cast now with Herb Jones or whoever you want to say, but realistically, those guys were not really in the mix at number 20. And I think that they kind of knew all along it was going to be kind of a redshirt year for Jalen, and we'll see what that sort of has in store for the future. You did mention, you snuck it in there, we're going to do a fake trades discussion later on in sort of a part 2 of this, but there is one sort of fake trade scenario that I've seen you talk about, so I want to do that now, because it involves the draft. People always ask me, like, should the Hawks or will the Hawks or could the Hawks, all that stuff, trade up in this draft? And I think that is interesting always. They have the capital. The Hawks have their future picks. They have the extra pick coming from Charlotte via New York, all that stuff. But, are you in the trade up camp as a potential option? And I know if you want to aim crazy high, you kind of have to go really high. We're talking about this without knowing the lottery, but is there a guy or two that you'd actually be really intrigued enough to kind of push some chips in for?
Yeah, I think that was a good setup for me. But yeah, I do really like Jaden Ivey in this class. I just think that he's very, very intriguing for a number of reasons. As we saw in the playoffs, one of the issues that the Hawks have had clearly is generating creation from additional players. If you look at their offensive rating over the last 2 playoffs, despite a lot of regular season success, I mean, they really have underachieved. They were 14th in offensive rating this year. They were 12th the year prior. Of course, a lot of that has to do with the nature of the opponents they played. Very, very good defenses, but that's who you're likely to see in the playoffs. And we've seen situations where teams like Miami are able to just suffocate Trey, and they don't have another incisive dribbler or someone who's able to create their own shots and create for others in a way that can scale up to primary usage if teams are committed to taking Trey off the board. So for that reason, I really do like Ivy. I think he's a very intriguing prospect. I probably honestly like him more for the Hawks than in most teams, because I have some doubts about his playmaking in a vacuum if you see him as like a primary, point guard, as opposed to somebody who can play off ball and get downhill. So for the Hawks, I really do like him a lot. I think he's like around 6'4". He's incredible coming down with speed. There's just a lot to like about him, and yeah. I think if you could give up a reasonable haul for him, I think it's worth pushing some chips in. Certainly, I think you have to include a player like at least of Collins' measure to really tempt the team. And you need a team like Portland or Sacramento, a team with aspirations of being good next year and is not committed to a full rebuild, because I think they're more likely to, want to play ball with you than if they were a team like Oklahoma City, which is still trying to build a foundation. But I just really think getting another ball handler, another guy who can create his own shot, is going to be a key part of whether the Hawks can unlock like a true contention window, like a team that can get to the finals, something along those lines, as opposed to being a team that's going to have difficulties getting out of the second round. So Ivy's a guy I really like.
Yeah, I kind of agree. I'm not as – I think you're probably a little bit higher on him in a vacuum than I am, but I do think that, the thought process of having him paired with a primary creator makes sense. Like for the draft standpoint, again, we're a day before the lottery, but I kind of been talking about Jaden Ivey with the Pistons for similar reasons, playing him with Cade, not having him have to be the guy, etc. Clearly it would take a lot. You mentioned the Collins name there. There is maybe like a pick-based package you could go with if you want to use sort of the DeAndre Hunter package to go way up, but the Hawks do and I mean that is like what they actually paid for DeAndre Hunter, not necessarily DeAndre Hunter now, but remembering this, just as a sort of comparison point, the Hawks had to pay, 3 assets to go up from 8 to 4 to draft DeAndre Hunter. Having to go from 16 up into the top 3 or 4 is going to take quite a bit. So I'm sure people probably recoiled when hearing that it might take Collins to do that. But that's just kind of the price of doing business. You have to pay a lot. I probably wouldn't do that, but I do understand the thought process behind it. And it always costs more than you want it to cost. And I will say Travis Schlenk has been known to fall in love, as he did with Hunter, and he'll kind of just pay whatever it has to pay to get a guy. And I'm not sure if that's Jaden Ivey. Obviously, it could be anybody, could be not a prospect at all. And that's the other thing that I want to ask you before we move on from this particular topic is like, I'm sure there's a thought process like, look, if you're going to trade up for a rookie, like, aren't you slowing down your timeline? And I don't necessarily have a problem with that, but I think internally, the Hawks, from ownership, especially on down, maybe aren't super thrilled to suddenly be, trading up for a draft pick right now and having to kind of slow things down. Does that concern you? I kind of know how you think about this stuff for the most part, but is that anything that's sort of in your mind if you were to do that?
Yeah, I think that's certainly true. And you're one of the biggest proponents. I know that, rookies are usually bad.
Yes.
So even if you trade up for like a top 5 pick and you get one of the top talents, the likelihood of them, generating impact along the lines of like a top 50 to 60 type player is just not very common.
It's so small. I mean, even last year, like you saw a great example last year is Jalen Green, who like had a lot of flashes late in the season, but 2 years ago, 3 years ago, Anthony Edwards was very similar to this. Like there are guys who by the end of the year, they're showing you something, but in terms of their full seasons as rookies, and these are top 2-3 picks that were like in the mix to go number 1 overall, or did go number 1 overall in Edwards' case, and they were still bad as rookies. Like that's just what happens.
Yeah. So to your point, I think that as far as helping them next year, it's less likely. But I also think that you have to have an eye beyond next year. I mean, that should just generally be how you approach things when you're trying to build a long-term contender. You shouldn't be so short-term oriented. And even on a team like Golden State, where the core of their team is in their 30s, they still use their draft picks to try and accumulate talent to potentially, help these guys as they age down the line. And, Trey is 23. Like he's not old. He's still a couple years away from his prime. So I think you could look at it like, well, we might be worse next year as far as, maybe we go out in the first round or something along those lines. But if we give Ivy a couple years to marinate, then maybe we have something that could potentially open a contention window for us down the road. So I think it's really, kind of how you perceive him as a talent for one, and whether you're willing to be patient through the first year or two when there might be some struggles in order to unlock the highest ceiling that you could have as a team during Trey's prime. So I think that's ultimately the goal. You want to have the best team possible around Trey when he's 26 and he's ready to make that deep, finals kind of run. So I think that's, the key part of the equation there. But I do think you're right that it's probably not something that makes them better for next year. But again, I think my priorities are further down the line.
Yeah, and I understand that completely. I just think that I'm not sure anyway. I shouldn't speak for them in absolutes, but I don't think that Tony Ressler is necessarily thrilled with slowing it down a little bit. We'll see. I'll be interested to see. And if Schlenk falls in love, he falls in love, and he's been willing to do that. So before I ask you about some guys in the Hawks' actual range at 16, if they don't trade up, a word from our sponsors on the podcast today. Today's show is brought to you by Rock Auto. In the auto world, as soon as it makes the models these days, it's basically impossible for local chain stores and dealerships to stock all the car truck parts that you actually need. And even if they had them, you actually want to endure the questioning from the person behind the counter. They want to sell what they want to sell from behind the counter or in their warehouse or wherever. Instead of doing all of that, you have access to rockauto.com at home or in your pocket. That's a much better option overall. And why spend more for the exact same auto parts at a chain store or dealership when you can order them at rockauto.com very, very easily? And rockauto.com is a family business you can support, and they've been serving customers for more than 2 decades at this point. The prices at rockauto.com are also reliably low and the same for each and every customer. They have all of what you need for your car or your truck. That includes brake parts and tail lamps, motor oil, even carpet. Wherever you are looking for your car or truck, they definitely have it at rockauto.com. And check out the website right now, rockauto.com, to see all the parts available for your car or your truck. And when you get there, write Locked On in the box that asks you how you heard about Rock Auto and tell them that we sent you over there. Amazing selection, reliable low prices, all the parts your car will ever need, rockauto.com. All right, Andrew. Of course, the Hawks are 16 overall. If they were to stay there, we don't know for sure who will be available, but we kind of have an idea of guys in that range. I'm not going to ask you to go through your entire board necessarily, but anybody sticking out to you that you've been looking for? I've been hearing a lot of Tari Eason love from Hawks fans and some other guys in that range as well, but what do you make of this range?
Yeah, I think Tari Eason's a good guy to start with. If you look at like the ESPN board, he's someone who has a pretty good chance to be on the table when the Hawks are able to draft their pick at 16. But he's interesting to me. I mean, he's 6'8". He's very explosive. He played most of his minutes at center and he came off the bench. So he's really an interesting prospect in a way because he's not like, someone who started at the 3 and contributed in that way. You have to kind of squint to think about what his best role is going to be in the NBA. I have some concerns about how his driving might translate when he's not, getting matched up against slower fitted bigs and that sort of thing. But I do think he's really interesting. I think in general, gambling on guys who are like 6'8" and athletic like he is, and most importantly too, get to the free throw line. I think that's a big deal. I think that's a really interesting gamble they can make in the middle of the draft. He's someone too that I could see a team sort of falling in love with, and maybe taking like the mid to late lottery as well. But I do like him. Like I said, I do have questions about how well his handle is going to translate, and I think that there's some feel issues with him. That's something that's going to take time to work out, and that's also concerning when you relate back to what I said initially about the minutes may not be there for guys who are developing, sort of raw prospects in a Nate McMillan type of system. But I think that there's a lot to like. In general, I think if you were to stay put with where they are, I think that's like one of the better picks they could make as far as like a combination of upside and some utility. I think they should be looking at guys that have some versatility, ability to play the 3 and the 4, and even some small ball 5 with him, I think is pretty tempting as well. So he's one of the guys that I would have higher on my board as far as like guys that the Hawks could take there.
Yeah, I mean, especially the defensive physicality that you can bring, and they don't really have a ton of that. I'm with you on the questions. For instance, I think he had more than double turnovers to assists last year at LSU. Not the ratio you want for a guy who's small forward size kind of player. And the shooting has been a little bit unclear. He had a decent year for 3 this year, but on a pretty small sample size. Was not a shooter at Cincinnati before that. So there are some questions for sure. He wasn't necessarily like a 5-star high school guy either. He was a top 100 guy, but sort of on the lower end of that. Ends up at Cincinnati, comes to LSU after that. So not a traditional path necessarily either. But I do think that in that range, being realistic and not expecting to get the former top 5 prospect Jalen Johnson every year at 20 or at 16 this time around was worthwhile. I think he'll be realistic in that range. Like, I don't know. There's so many guys we could touch on. I think for the most part, I've kind of identified 10 or 11, maybe 12 guys that I'm like pretty sure are going to be gone. And then there's like a range of like 15, 20 guys that they could reasonably sort of take. Do you have like a personal favorite? Is it Eason? Like, what's your semi-realistic dream scenario at 16?
Well, Easton I like a lot, just again because I like the combination of upside and the ability to be versatile across positions. And drawing free throws, I think, again, is very important when you look at their Hawks roster construction. They just don't have they don't have a lot of guys who are good at getting to the line. So that's something that is important that I think he could add. So he probably is like my realistic favorite there, I guess. And you mentioned him at the start of the podcast too, but Ochai Agbaji, I think, is really interesting just because if you had to look at this range of players and you're trying to get somebody that I think could, at least compete with DeAndre Hunter or back him up, something along those lines, like he's somebody I could see cracking a rotation pretty early. He's someone that I think coaches are going to be inclined to like. I've seen him mocked in various places. I think ESPN's board has him at the end of the lottery, like 13 or 14 or something, but I think he has a good chance to make it there. But, he's someone that, again, I think he can contribute early. He's a little bit undersized if you see him as a 3. I think he's like around 6'5" or so with like a 6'10" wingspan. But he shot over 40% from deep on 6.5 attempts per game. He's only a 71% foul shooter, so it's possible that, that number might, favor him a little bit and might not hold up on a longer sample. But a good defender, a good shooter, someone who I think is ready to play. He's just someone that I think could potentially contribute early and be a good value on a rookie deal. So he's someone that I tend to really like in their range.
Yeah, if you're going for the more what we talked about before, sort of the more not necessarily conservative, but more the short-term facing, he would be high on the list if he's available. The exact opposite, I know we mentioned him earlier, was Patrick Baldwin. That's more the home run-ish kind of guy. A former, literally, he was number 1 in the class at one point a couple of years ago, and now had a disaster season at Milwaukee playing for his dad. And I think will probably be available when the Hawks pick. 19-year-old, but he's like 6'9" with shooting attributes and pretty interesting stuff there. And like you get into like Blake Wesley, and you get into a guy that I love, like probably a little bit early for him, but like I love Dalen Terry from Arizona as a potential Hawks guy. If they wanted to, like, if Schlenk just falls in love with someone and doesn't care about value, I think Dalen Terry at 16 might be something that's kind of in play. I don't know. It's just interesting to me. Like, the board is so wide open in my mind that essentially only the true centers are kind of off the board. And even then, because of like the potential that the Hawks could move on from either Okongwu or Capella in the coming days. Like, if they were going to plan to do that, you could draft Mark Williams. Like, I'm not saying you need to do that, but you could if you had a plan otherwise. Obviously, that's the one spot right now on the roster they don't need is another center. But, the board is very, very open for them.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it's also a thing, too, where, it's kind of anticlimactic. But if you were to think back to the 2015 draft when they traded that pick for Timmy Hardaway, this is something that I think they could do here, too. If you could get like a proven role player or something like that.
That is very much in play, Andrew. I will tell you that right now. It should surprise absolutely no one if they either trade the pick for a player or attach the pick to Gallo or do something to get a player now. That should surprise no one at all.
Yeah, it just seems like a logical thing to do here because this draft is, it isn't as interesting to me as some past drafts are, but I still like some of the forwards in that range. I don't know where you are on like Jeremy Zohan from Baylor, but I mean, he's pretty interesting. He's raw, but he's very athletic at 6'9". I think he has like a 7-foot wingspan. He'll only be 19 on draft day, so he's a young guy, and he has these really interesting like skill flashes. He'll show some self-creation at times. He can pass for others. I think he's probably a 4, so he kind of runs into Jalen Johnson there, so that's an issue. And he has some bad shooting numbers.
He was under going to. I think. The more I hear about him, I think he's going to be a lottery pick, to be honest. But we'll see.
He's an interesting package. I mean, he shot below 30% from deep, and I don't know how good he is for the Hawks in general. But in a vacuum, I think he's pretty interesting in this part of this draft.
Definitely. He's definitely more of an upside play, and his defense would be pretty interesting. Like, I think that's what I like about him the most is the playmaking you mentioned too, but the defensive potential for him. My all-time dream pick here for the Hawks is Dyson Daniels, who I think is going to be gone. But if he were to get to 16, he's the guy that if I had to pick one guy right now that's like even like a 10% realistic, he'd be the guy that I would choose. Just for people that don't know him, he is more of a. I mean, he's got shooting guard size, even small forward size. He's 6'7", but like has point guard handle and is a great defender, great feel. Shooting is a little bit questionable, but that's less of a problem next to Trey. I just think that he checks a ton of boxes and is like an actual lottery talent as well. Again, that's more of a like it falls in your lap thing, like it happened with Jalen last year, where he was not on my board really at all because he's going to be gone. That might be the same thing with Dyson Daniels, but I love Dyson Daniels. I'm in.
Yeah, he's someone that I also think will be gone by then, but it just makes a lot of sense for the Hawks in general.
I totally agree. Anything else you want to add on the draft before we move on? Because clearly we're 5 weeks away as we record this. A lot could change. The Hawks could trade out, like you said before. Obviously for content purposes, it'd be better if they did not do that until draft night because we can talk about the draft next 5 weeks. But I don't know. It's just going to be interesting to me. I have a lot of guys that I like, a lot of guys that I'm probably a little bit less excited about. But truly, I'm going to try hard not to say that like anyone's a huge reach because I think there really is kind of a very large. I'm not sure if it's one tier, but I'm sure that there's probably 25 guys that I think would be like defensible picks at 16, which is, it sounds like a ton. I understand that, but I'm telling you, between like basically anybody from that's not in the top 10 all the way down to like 30, 35, they're all kind of not the same players, but kind of similar in terms of like what you could slot yourself on.
Yeah, I agree with that. And in general, I just kind of frame how I would approach this draft in like a series of actions. If you can get, I think Eason and I think Abaji are basically like par picks. They're guys that I think you can do well on if they were to make it to you. And then I really like scenarios like trading up for Ivy and trying to consolidate like a future talent in that way, I think is important. But I also just like, trading out and trying to swap it for a role player, someone who can help you next year. So it's an interesting draft where I think there's more on the table that maybe I think is given credit for, just because there's a lot of options that could potentially be available. But like you said, there's a ton of different prospects, so it's kind of an eye of a beholder in that sense, where some guys might like a Ty Washington or someone like that, So it just kind of depends on what you're looking for. But Eason and Abaji are two guys that I've kind of centered on in this range.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Ty because I'll come back to him later on. But he's listed as 6'3", like a 6'8", 6'9" wingspan. And I know this is very, very simple, but Kentucky guards just seem to be better in the NBA than they are in college. And I wonder, and I've always liked him anyway. His game's pretty interesting. And like, he's a weird fit in some ways because he's kind of, he's not the hugest guy in the world. He's more of a combo. But given what we talked about earlier with the Hawks, what they don't have in terms of shot creation and all that stuff, he might be a pretty intriguing, like at minimum third guard. And that may not sound super exciting, but at 16 overall, drafting a quality third guard is actually a good outcome. Which people you have to realize what you're getting in the middle of the first round. If you actually could get a solid 6th, 7th man at 16 overall, it's actually a win for you. So keep that in mind too. Not you, Andrew. Everybody else should keep that in mind. I know you know this.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. If you get, a third guard, like a good rotation player in the middle of the draft, when you look at historic outcomes, like that's good. And I think a lot of people just don't value that as much, or they don't think about historical outcomes there. But yeah, it makes sense.
I mean, one example before we get out of here on this episode is Kevin Huerter. I was not a third guard, but Kevin Huerter at 19 is like a full-on,
it's a smash,
A-grade draft pick. Yeah, I mean, I know that not everybody loves Kevin Huerter, and I get that. There's people that think that he's more of like just a guy, but regardless of what you think about Kevin Huerter, unless you're just comically low on him, he's at least like a third wing on a good team, and that guy at number 19 overall is a great pick. So obviously, it's better to get John Collins at 19, who became like a top 50 player in the league. But like, you have to be realistic, and so you can't hit on every one of those guys. So anytime you can find someone that can contribute to you long term, short term, et cetera, at 19 or 16 in this case, it's a very, very, very positive outcome. So keep that in mind as well. Andrew, we'll have more with you coming up later this week. But before we get out of here, please plug what you got going on. I know you're not like the most prolific writer necessarily in public spaces, but you're always tweeting and talking about draft stuff and thinking about team building and all that fun stuff. So where can people find your stuff?
Yeah, I think not a prolific writer is a good way to describe my output. Yeah, you can find me on Twitter. A Kelly is what I use there. ANDLANKELL is my handle. But yeah, hit me up on there.
Follow Andrew on the Twitter machine. I recommend that, and we'll have him back later on this week with some fake trades, because he is the first person in the world I thought of to ask about fake trades. So that's coming up later in the week. Please subscribe to this podcast, and we'll see you next time.